Hello, everyone. This is Trip. And guess what? This very special episode of the podcast is an even more exciting invitation. An invitation for you to join John Cobb and myself for Christianity in Process. That is going to be a 6-week exploration of process theology. We're going to be looking at the way in which people that are disciples and followers of Jesus practice religion and the key of world loyalty, which I'm sure you'll learn more about as the class goes on. But most of all, I am pumped that I, get to hang out with JC himself, John Cobb, and we get to proselytize the world on behalf of the process vision of Christianity, not in a coercive way, but in an alluring way. And I think the process vision of the faith is beautiful. It's compelling, it's inspiring, and it calls forth from those of us that are disciples of Jesus a greater commitment to the world, to its liberation, to the life-giving relations that God desires for it to be made material, to be made reality. And I found it as an individual asking big questions in the South as a minister's kid. When I was in my 19th or 20th year of life, and have loved it since then. And the person that has had the biggest impact on me intellectually, and then when I got to meet him, became not just a mentor, but like the kind of person I hope becomes something like, is John Cobb. So John, I am so excited to get to do this with you. And I hope you don't regret saying yes to this by the time we get done with the whole class. And for the kind of preview session, as a way of invitation, you're going to kick off, and the question is, why stay a Christian? So you're going to be answering the question individually, and then we'll have some follow-up conversation and such. And anyone that's interested in joining the class, it is open to any and all. It's donation, including zero, so anyone can join. They can go to christianityinprocess.com. It's a very catchy URL. You can go there, sign up, register, and then hang out with John, myself, and a whole bunch of people that are looking forward to learning from his wisdom. So with that, I will let you take it over, John, and you can tell us why you're still a Christian.
Okay. Well, I chose this. You gave me several choices of what we might do today. And I thought this was the one I would most enjoy dealing with because it's a serious question. In previous generations, it hasn't been a serious question for most Christians. I mean, of course, at various points in history, that's not the case. But when you live in a Christian culture and the schools have a Christian orientation and the newspapers take for granted that most people are Christian, and you go to a university, and especially if you go to a church university, but really almost any university, they take for granted you're a Christian. It's just a question of what kind. Oh, you might be a Jew. I mean, it isn't that. And one of the reasons I'm a Christian, I'm sure, is because I grew up in a generation in which we were all Christian, and it just hasn't seemed to me important to change. But I don't want to primarily focus on these sociological reasons, but talk more existentially about this. It's interesting that it is a question that was also asked by Jesus. He put it a little differently, but apparently lots of people who had been interested in what he was saying lost interest, and they were abandoning him. They weren't following him anymore. And he turned to the 12, and he said, well, you also. And Peter gave an answer, which I think I'll mention now, but come back to later and say, Lord, to whom could we go? So a lot of my time I'm going to be spending on talking about why none of the options I'm aware of seem to me to be an improvement. and why I do deeply recognize that who I am is one who is trying to be a disciple of Jesus. And that's not an arbitrary choice, it's just who I am. I mean, I discovered that. That doesn't mean that's what everybody discovers when they press themselves. But if you do discover that, then that has consequences for. And I think the consequences of finding that to be the case are very positive ones. So I'm glad to share my struggle with the question. There was really one point when I was a student at the University of Chicago when I almost, against my will, ceased to be a Christian. At least for me, being a Christian includes serving the God Jesus served. And I was, for the first time in my life, experiencing the fact that in the modern world, everything is explained without God. And this wasn't something people were explicitly saying, they were just doing it. And the idea of bringing God into the conversation as explaining anything just wasn't a topic to be discussed. It was so obviously not possible. And it's hard not to be, if you're in the midst of a community in which that's just taken for granted, and the success that the modern mind has had in explaining a great many things without introducing God is immense. And so all of a sudden, God just didn't seem to enter into things. When I say all of a sudden, of course, it was cumulative, but my existential realization that it wasn't that I wanted to stop believing in God, I just didn't believe in God. So I'm not completely lacking in understanding why lots of people have stopped being Christian. And there are other reasons beside that. I wrote a book with a communist friend who was really very curious how any intelligent person could be a Christian. And he was open to hearing it. I mean, he wasn't a rigid, closed-minded kind of a person at all, but he kept pressing me and I kept answering. Well, before he had finished his part of the book, he died. So I doubt the book will ever be finished. But it was an occasion for reflecting on how we could continue to affirm that being a Christian was a good thing when the history of what Christian churches have done, the history of what Christian nations have done, the history of what Christian cultures have done is not a glowing one. One has to admit and confess that. But one reason that is not decisive for me is that Christians are constantly praying for forgiveness. We aren't pretending that everything's okay. And so I can acknowledge that what the churches have done, what the supposedly Christian nations have done, is really has so many ugly, ugly aspects to it. And that indeed, it is the Christian part of the world that has led the world into its present desperate crisis. So Christianity must accept a good deal of the responsibility for the fact that human life may not be possible on this planet much longer. The seriousness of our crimes, even when we thought we were doing the right thing, it's not to be underestimated. But I felt pretty good by the time we were advanced in writing the book. He was understanding how one could be a Christian and did not have to be a fool or a villain in order to be a Christian. So my answer is, first of all, it's a legitimate question. It's very easy to think that the basic beliefs, especially the theism, but also other aspects of belief, cannot be true because the dominant intellectual world says they cannot be true. And it's very easy to see how a person who studies our history carefully will find so much in it that if we were not constantly aware of our sinfulness and of our finiteness, of our limitedness, because not all of the bad things we have done have been vicious. Some of them have just been out of ignorance. So I will return now to the question, where would one go? Or where do people go when they cease to be Christians? And I think many of the best of them go to being spiritual but not religious. And that move for many of them just means I'm not going to go to church anymore. I'm not going to assume that Christianity is better than alternative faiths. I said I'm not going to give up my self-understanding that I have derived from my culture, that I'm a free and responsible human being, and that there is more to life than money, so forth and so on. So I have to say then, why is that not an improvement? And there are, I think, a variety of reasons, but I will say, for me, historical thinking is extremely important. And the people who give up religion often give up that aspect of Christianity and of the Bible. I have become convinced that no other form of world spirituality makes history central and essential. But for me, history is central. Now that's, of course, it's just a circle. I'm saying, I just discovered that something that I believe very strongly, I've gotten it from the Bible. And that I've gotten it from the Bible is clearer to me because those who don't pay much attention to the Bible very rarely think historically. That can be overstated. At other points in the course, we can bring up these matters again. Today is just introducing, but I will say that I do believe that at different points in history, different things are needed. I do believe that I need to be critically aware of what is going on in the world, and that I am called to be responsive to the specifics of my situation and my time. And this is one reason that I have been preoccupied with the fact that human beings are destroying the living system of the planet. I think that if you don't think historically, it's very, very rare that this becomes anything more than one incidental point. But it's not one incidental point, it's an all-important point. That's the way I feel about it. And when I discover that I feel that way because of the Bible, it doesn't make me be a Christian. I could be a Jew or a Muslim. The Bible is not in that respect the only source, but the Muslim scriptures are so dependent on the Hebrew scriptures that I'm just including all of that. So I don't want to give up all of that. I also think that very often the people who are spiritual but not religious just think that what's already going on is okay, except they want to be sure that they personally have the benefits of spirituality. The spiritual but not religious tend to be individualistic. Now, I'm not saying all of them, but I'm just talking about a tendency. When one gives up Christianity, you may still believe that you should love your neighbor, but the teaching about loving the neighbor is often extremely individualistic. It's you as an individual loving your neighbor who is another individual. Whereas my sense is, based on Jesus, that my enemies are also my neighbors. That's rarely affirmed even by Christians, even though it's right there, the first chapter of the Sermon on the Mount, which is where we should be looking if we want to know what Jesus taught. But I find I do believe that that's important, and I don't find any other sources that clearly teach that outside of the teaching of Jesus. Just to take one example. Then another possibility, if you give up Christianity, is to allow the kinds of beliefs promoted by the intellectuals of our time or the scholars of our time. I'll just call it the university culture. And especially for people who have lived so much of their lives in that culture, that would be a possibility for me. But I find that the university culture also lacks any historical orientation. And it is so fragmenting in a really appalling way. The goal, the push of the university culture. I hope I don't have to say, I'm not talking about every professor or every university president, anything of that kind. I think one can talk about what is the university culture in a meaningful way and say that it has given up on any unifying vision. There's no academic department that seeks that. There's not, even in the field of science, there's no longer any unifying vision. And unifying vision is just very important to me. Maybe it shouldn't be. I'm not arguing that the things that are important to me have to be important to you or to anybody else, but they are important to me, and I have struggled to have such a vision. And I think that I have been helped immensely by a few people who were certainly university professors, but in a previous generation. The university has not followed them. And Whitehead is the most important of these for me. And it's not that he is unscientific. He simply thinks that scientists don't think deeply enough about it. And in our day, there's a lot of empirical evidence that doesn't fit with the scientific worldview. Well, it takes a lot more faith to accept the understanding of reality that is promoted indirectly in the university than it does to accept a basically biblical point of view. Now, I'm using faith in what I do not consider a Christian sense, but so many people mean by faith believing something even if you don't have any evidence for it. The evidence is all against the modern worldview, and this is evidence discovered by modernists. But they're so committed to not believing in God, for example, that the evidence for God is simply not allowed. They prefer to think that there are thousands or millions of universes rather than that there is one. Well, the only reason, no evidence whatsoever for this staggering belief, but you have to have that in order that they can use their favorite expression that this is all a matter of chance. So this to me should not be science. It's not rational. It's dogmatic. You know something isn't so, regardless of the evidence. Therefore, you will not let the evidence lead to conclusion. So I don't find this an endearing and an attractive direction to go. And I think it simply makes it more difficult for people to find any meaning in their lives. So that's why I don't go that way. Okay. Now we could go through a lot of other possibilities, and I would enjoy doing it, but I think I shouldn't go to too many. But let me take one that has attracted a lot of Westerners in recent times, at which my feelings about are not nearly as negative as my feelings about the modern university. Buddhism is a wonderful ideal, and its effects in society have been much less damaging than the effects of Christianity. That doesn't mean that individual Buddhists haven't done some awful things. But all the things I've talked about as being good in Christianity, its historical consciousness, can also lead it to make really terrible judgments and to do really terrible things. Now, Buddhism is ahistorical, and it is a wonderful deconstruction of any system of positive belief. And through deconstructing everything, including deconstructing even the quest for some kind of meaning, people can be led to a kind of peace and acceptance and even compassion. I'm attracted to that, but I find that I can't live by deconstruction alone. I really need to have some convictions, and they are historical convictions. And they mean that simply to be reconciled and peaceful and calm about the fact that the world is destroying itself is just not something that attracts me. I also find that a Christian can practice Buddhism without ceasing to be a Christian. And I know that there are Buddhists who have organized in order to make Buddhist implications about the problems of the world much more explicit and to really work on them. But I think that's more of a stretch for Buddhists. I think it is more difficult for Buddhists to develop a historical consciousness and have strong feelings about social ethics than it is for Christians to benefit from profound insights of Buddhism. One reason I feel very positive, because the Whitehead's metaphysics and Buddhist metaphysics are almost identical. But there is a difference. And the difference is that for Whitehead, getting rid of bad ways of thinking paves the way for coming to a more positive way of thinking about things. Well, I'll talk about, I have spent a lot of time recently working with Chinese. And in China, Buddhism has been very influential, but the Chinese, like me, have wanted to think positively about the way things are, not just deconstruct, but also to construct. And they have felt that it's very important to especially know what makes for a good society. And so Confucius has been more characteristic of China than Buddhism. And Confucianism has given rise to probably more stable societies and reduced the element of conflict and violence in society more successfully than Christianity. So I think we need to recognize that just as Buddhism does some things better than Christianity does, Confucianism does some things better than Christianity has. But there are too many questions that I ask that Confucius doesn't ask. His understanding of society, quite properly, this is not, I hate to sound like I'm criticizing everybody else, but of course I do evaluate, and I think his understanding of how to live in a quite normal world, not demanding unreasonable sacrifice from anybody, has been able to help communities of people survive. I mean, Chinese culture has been extraordinarily successful over thousands of years. There's nothing like the comparable to it in the West. Nevertheless, I can't go to Confucius and ask, in a time like ours, when we are committed to things that are leading us in the wrong direction, what do we do about the fact that the world is being so governed by a kind of economic thinking that is leading us to stupid and utterly self-destructive activities? But I've got to ask those questions. I can't really get help from Confucius. So within the realm that he has operated, that he did give such guidance to, he helps a great deal, but I just care too much about things. We live in a global situation. His focus is upon local communities. They can be fairly large, but it's simply different. So that's another example of taking seriously options and admiring people who do follow those options, but saying, no, not a possibility for me. When I say, well, if these, and I could go down a list of other possibilities and talk about why they don't work for me, and then I say, well, okay, I'll recognize that I have been so formed by one tradition that how I think and how I act, I've grown out of that tradition, and I'm not really prepared to give it up, even if there are lots of bad things that have happened in connection with that. But then I also, when I go back and think about and read about Jesus, I'm not simply saying that I think nobody's doing any better. I'm thinking, here is a really extraordinary figure in human history. The less we talk about his being divine and thereby sort of exempting him from locating him among the other great people in human history, I mean, that's a way of dismissing him, really, for so many people. But if we just say, okay, we do know something about him historically, and we have fairly reliable ideas about what he taught. And right now, I think the only possible survival of Christianity will come if we love our enemies. And I don't know anywhere else to go for that teaching. It was a Hindu who finally really followed Jesus. So I don't want to brag about Christians. I think Christians have done a marvelous job of ignoring this teaching of Jesus. But Gandhi didn't. And Gandhi liberated India from the British Empire because he based his life on the teaching of Jesus. And Martin Luther King, in this case, a Christian, transformed the understanding of race and racism on the whole planet. The changes that he made are absolutely astonishing. And he did it all on the basis of following Jesus. You couldn't have done it based on the following of, I don't want to put Muhammad down or something, but I don't think that he gave us that. I don't think that you find it in the Old Testament. I think it's rather, Jesus thought he was breaking new ground. You've heard you should love your neighbor, that kind of thing. But people have expected that you would hate your enemy. But he said, no, unless we love our enemies, we're not following him. And I don't know anywhere else one finds such a clear statement that you cannot serve both God and money. If you serve one, you will hate the other. And in a world that has chosen to serve money, I can't think of a more, and that is so central to why we're destroying ourselves, I can't think of a more important teaching. There's much else. Jesus was an absolutely marvelous storyteller. Look through history and try to find someone else who has produced a literature comparable to the parables of Jesus. He really is amazing. And if we just think of him as a human being, a Jew among Jews, and that in his 20s, he was able to have such insights, then I think saying there is no better person to follow than Jesus, and that we shouldn't be apologetic about saying that. I don't think that needs to put anybody else down. I think one can follow Jesus and believe that there are many topics Jesus didn't discuss that are discussed better by other people. I think we can do that better with Jesus than with almost anyone else. So I don't think it's a matter of narrow prejudice and just habit or just culture that makes me say, I'm a Christian unless being a Christian means believing a lot of stuff that came along later. I don't think the Trinitarian Creed makes any sense. I believe in the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, fine. But to say these are all one substance, three persons, that just doesn't make any sense to me. I don't want to go through the things in Christianity, the beliefs that I'm not comfortable with. This isn't the place. I don't think Christianity is fundamentally the matter of repeating sayings that made sense with the philosophy and culture of the time, but don't make sense to us. I don't think we should put Anselm of Canterbury and say, unless you agree with Anselm of Canterbury, you're not a Christian. He disagreed so much with the Bible, and I think the Bible should play a larger role in our understanding. And I certainly don't believe the Bible is infallible. I don't know how anybody can believe that, because it contradicts itself all over the place, not on what is most important, but if something were inerrant, all the stories about the resurrection would be consistent with each other. So it would be possible to believe them all. Mark says the women didn't tell anybody. Well, the other gospels think they did, okay? How can both be true? I just don't understand that mindset that wants to talk about inerrancy. It's not a biblical mindset.
Well, that was wonderful. When you make the line to Anselm at the end, for those that don't know, he's the guy that kind of kicked off the whole substitutionary atonement thing. And this past week, for a class I'm teaching, I had to reread Anselm, and I never noticed he has a significant discourse where he explains how loving your enemy really is a nonsensical idea and should not be taken seriously by leaders.
No, I think Jesus is wiser than Anselm. I really do.
One of the questions that comes to mind after hearing that and knowing your own kind of story and work is that underneath a lot of the distinctions you're drawing between other options and staying Christian is your own experience of the one Jesus called Abba, and how your own relationship to Jesus has in some ways stayed the same and also changed over time from Methodist missionary kid to through the academy, your activism and such like that. So if you're thinking of people who are asking that same question, should I stay Christian or should I consider this as a viable path in the present, what is it about Jesus and the one he calls Abba that you find compelling today?
Yes. Well, one of the things that I like to emphasize is that whereas for a long time, it seemed that with the advance of science, there was a retreat in the role of God. But that's not true anymore. Scientific evidence points to there being within the whole world a purpose, and the purpose of making life possible and supporting it. There is no evidence for the idea of divine omnipotence. There couldn't be any evidence. The very questioning and seeking evidence indicates people make some decisions for themselves. But according to divine omnipotence, we don't make any decisions. They're all made by God. So for me, it's very important that we think about the God in a way that fits the Bible. The Bible never suggests that human beings have no power whatsoever. It always assumes human beings make real decisions that affect what happens, and that God responds to those decisions. So that kind of interactive God is the biblical God. Now, why Jesus, Abba, rather than some of the other notions of God that one finds in Scripture? And we'd have to go through those in some detail, which I won't try to do now. But the sense that God is just is sometimes dominant also in scriptural passages. It's kind of the background taken for granted even in some of Jesus' parables. But it's not the point of the parables. I mean, one can simply see how pervasive that there are. If you do the right things, God rewards you. If you do the wrong things, you're not going to get the same treatment. Jesus, Abba, just the very same passage in which we were referring to earlier about loving one's enemy. God sends his rain on the just and the unjust. God treats everyone lovingly, even if they are not obedient at all. That's very explicit in Jesus. And I'm not saying that no other Jew believed it. I'm just saying, if we focus on Jesus, Abba, that question is settled. It's not that God likes us if we are good and dislikes us or likes us less. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's an extremely important understanding. I think Jesus, Abba, was, by no means radically different from the God that many of the Hebrew people of the time lived. But I think there was much more a mixture of other things. The notion that God loves us, that's definitely not an un-Jewish idea. It's a Jewish idea. But it is so much more central and determinative of everything else that Jesus says. So I think Jesus, Abba, is the God of Israel. But it's the form that the thinking about the God of Israel takes that is most meaningful to me, and I think is most coherent with what we know metaphysically. I mean, Jesus' example of the weather. Good climate doesn't come to people because they're good. God does it for everybody. So I do strongly recommend the Bible in general, and then strongly recommend that one allows Jesus to have the last word. Well, Paul tells us some things that are worth knowing too, but he thought he was continuing the message of Jesus, and I think in a remarkable way he was.
Mm-hmm. You when you mentioned the kind of seeming absurdity of loving your enemies, and yet that makes like that you said that our only chance for survival that we have is to learn to love our enemies.
Absolutely.
Earlier tonight, when I was putting Cora, our 8-year-old, to bed, we just started going through the Sermon on the Mount earlier this week, and I'm trying to go through it slowly to lead up to Easter. And we read the love your enemies passage. And I said, Cora, why do you think this is one of the things Jesus said I know is 100% true, and I have a hard time living it out? And she goes, well, are you sure it's true for everybody? And I go, well, what do you mean? She goes, well, does it depend on the kind of enemy you have? And I was like, well, what would be a really bad enemy? She's like, well, Putin's doing really mean things to people, but God made Putin and she loves him completely. I just don't know how to, because I don't think you should hurt people. And I was like, yeah. And she goes,
if you don't love anybody who hurts people, your love is going to be rather restricted.
Yeah.
You'd have a hard time loving yourself.
Exactly. And so at the end of the thing, I said, when we were going to do our prayer, I said, Cora, how would we pray if we wanted to learn how to do this? And she said, well, then we'd pray, God, we know we are your beloved. Help us see each other and even our enemies as your beloved.
Wow.
And that, like, it's a simple thing. And yet it makes perfect sense to us why it's crazy. And yet, if we want to survive, we want to thrive, that needs to be a very live option. But in communities with that at the heart.
Doesn't mean that you treat your enemy the way the enemy wants to be treated.
Exactly.
I mean, Gandhi upset the British a lot, but he upset them by his love, not by his violence and hatred. I think Jesus was the enemy that Jesus has most clearly in mind is Rome. And I'm sure it wasn't easy for Jews to love Romans. He gives us the example of going the second mile. And if you really think about it, Jesus thought that if the Jews would go the second mile, that the relationship between Jews and Romans would be transformed. He did not think the Romans would declare the Jews to be independent of the Roman Empire. I don't think he thought that. But I think he thought at least they would not be expelled from Palestine. But I think he thought it'd be much better than that. And I think it would have been. It would have been so surprising to a Jewish soldier, to a Roman soldier, to have a Jew who really emotionally cared for him. The Roman soldier was just as much being oppressed as the Jew was. Not in that particular relationship, but the way most soldiers were treated by the higher-ups in their armies and so forth. Extremely oppressive.
Yeah. And that for those that haven't read the Sermon on the Mount recently, that one of the other lines in it is when the soldier compels you to walk 1 mile, which is the legal limit, Jesus goes, "We'll walk a 2nd mile," as a way of non-violently resisting the kind of power that's inherent in that imperial relationship.
Yeah.
And those are the kind of that's the kind of wisdom that is not regularly available when the options placed before you are the ones that dominate most of Western culture.
And I regret to say I have very rarely heard sermons preached on that topic. It's too countercultural. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to stop being a Christian because the church won't follow Jesus.
Well, you mentioned earlier in what you said that one of the reasons you can stay Christian despite all the counter witness of the testimony in church history is that Christians are constantly praying for forgiveness.
Exactly.
Now, when a lot of people that may not have positive relationships with forgiveness and sin talk and guilt and even praying, can you describe from your perspective, like how do you as a process theologian understand something when we as a collective in church, most churches in the liturgy rather quickly, we thank God, announce the presence of God, our presence in it, and then we confess sin and then pronounce forgiveness. How do you understand that moment as a way of being honest rather than something that kind of preserves hypocrisy?
Well, I think if one really believes that God loves one independently of whether one is good or bad, that leads to loving God. This is a God we can really love. And if we love God and then ask whether we are involved in things that don't express that love, and then as this can be as individuals, and Jesus was really interested in the Jewish people. The role of the Messiah was not just for individuals, it was for the whole society. And the Jews admired those who rose up violently against Rome, even though they were always killed. Maybe because they were. That shows how heroic they were. But Jesus understood that there was no positive future for the Jewish people if they kept that up. So, as a Jew, to repent of the appeal to military strength, to foolishly, really, to throw the Romans off, that would make sense to Jesus. For me, to be part of a nation that is aiming to control the whole world and is destroying those countries that won't go along with that, that means I need to ask for forgiveness for my nation. But unfortunately, we haven't made it clear to most people. We love our nation. And historically, that's very important that we love our nation. But loving our nation, just as loving our neighbor or loving ourselves, is not not expressed in defensively saying, oh, we have good reasons for everything we do. If you really love someone, you want to be truthful about it. If you love yourself, you need to be, but you need to have the context of being forgiven in order to acknowledge. I'm right now, I've been exposed to the fact that there are a number of organizations, large organizations with hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of followers, that are helping people to become more spiritual, definitely not religious in the sense we were speaking of, but go even farther than liberal Protestantism, which also leans very much in this direction, in recognizing people must be assured and feel good about themselves in order to be able to be concerned even for their neighbors. And there's a certain truth in this, but Jesus' understanding is much deeper. It is not that we must reassure ourselves that we're good and important and so forth in order to be at peace. It is that we know we are loved in spite of the fact that we are not. Then we can be honest about not being. If not, it's just psychologically admitting that you're doing the wrong thing is self-destructive. It's something we sort of take for granted out of our Christian heritage, and we do more than pay lip service, but we don't really carry it to its deep meaning. I mean, lots of individuals do, but collectively as Christians, I worked in a wonderful, loving congregation. But I'm going to say, it's very good at comforting the afflicted. It is not very good at afflicting the comfortable. And it's because afflicting the comfortable makes it hard to comfort them. And that, I think, is because our relationship to God is not really thought through, understood, clarified. I don't mean that we don't all believe in God, we all pray to God. We all, in a Methodist congregation, we know God loves us and we should love God. But too much of it is verbal, but not really thought through.
Do you think part of the, or maybe why do you think there's been this tendency among more progressive or liberal Protestants to preserve in many ways, kind of the moral vision of Jesus's teachings, the kingdom of God, that kind of stuff and what it looks like, but not preserve in many ways the kind of intimacy Jesus invited his disciples into, and the kind of piety or the way of engaging the world that he did? It's kind of like a vision of the faith became so much ethics that when I would be doing confirmation with, UCC teenagers in Los Angeles, they're like, look, I'm more than happy to volunteer for Greenpeace, but can I sleep in on Sunday? And that kind of thing. What do you see, or what's been your understanding of how that shift happened? Because the world you were born into, mainline Protestants had a much richer piety in the congregations and in the life of the church.
The social gospel was a significant expansion and partner to the personal piety. And I miss that so much. Well, the social gospel pretty much ended with World War II. I really don't know fully how it happened. For one thing, of course, neo-orthodoxy was not a social gospel movement. the liberation theologies that emerged out of it were. But they arose in cultures different from ours. Except feminism, of course, that was a social gospel, insofar as that operated in the church. But basically, I think that neo-orthodoxy countered pietism, but not in a way that really, was deeply accessible to the vast majority of American Protestants. And it went back to the only scripture principle, which tended to keep us focused upon what happened a long time ago. In a Germany dominated by Hitler, talking a lot about current events was not a possibility. So there was a point in having a doctrine that didn't directly deal with issues like that. So I think neo-orthodoxy is partly responsible, but I also think that the period after World War II was a huge boom for the church sociologically. But what the soldiers wanted was not to come back to be challenged to do something. They wanted to have families and settle down to the good old American way of life. I think that preachers didn't want to bring in controversial matters to disrupt that. And then a third relevant point is that the meaning of liberal is almost inherently open. And the liberal churches were open to the culture of the time, and especially open to the teaching of the university. In the churches I've been part of, university has always been spoken of with the greatest respect. And you really don't want to teach things that the experts in the university don't agree with. And that makes it very hard to talk seriously about what God is doing in the world and in your life. And in many sermons about what's happening in your life didn't bring God into the picture. I think that following Jesus is going to be countercultural in any human culture. And liberalism tends not to be countercultural. So those are some of the reasons for the change. I think about the fact that when I went to college, even if some people went to college so they could get a better job, I'm not saying that didn't happen, but to announce that that's your reason for going to college. No, college is for education. I don't think I need to develop that. But today, colleges advertise themselves in terms of helping people rise up into a higher economic status. Actually, that's almost the only reason it's given in many, many cases. And if you ask students why they came to college, 90% or more will give an answer along those lines. Well, that's a huge cultural change and not one that I think highly of. But I have heard almost no criticism in the church.
Yeah.
That to me is a sign of being more shaped by the culture you live in than being shaped by the counterculture that your sacred writings offer you.
Mm-hmm.
And
all right, so I have two more questions.
Yes.
Before we wrap up, but remember, anyone that's watching and or listening, you can join the class, ChristianityInProcess.com. All right, so next to last question. In the conversation, you made a snarky aside towards the Trinity because it was developed positively in a time under different philosophical assumptions. But today, do we want to create that as a boundary kind of thing? And other time we've talked, you're like, I'm only a real stickler on the incarnation as a doctrine, which we'll spend the whole session on in the class. But I think one thing that might be helpful before beginning a journey of process in Christianity, what is faith, and how do you understand faith if it's not dogma? Now, I know that's not how you see it, but you are known as a theologian among a lot of other things. So what is the actual purpose of theology if it's not drawing distinctions and boundaries to be assented to and affirmed and then defended?
Well, I think it's very unfortunate that faith has come to mean believing things because some authority tells you that. And I don't care whether the authority is the church or the Bible or anything else. I think that the Greek word pistis, which we translate as faith, is in most cases better translated as faithfulness. I think faithfulness is very important. But Paul talks about God's pistis. And what would it mean to say that God believes things on somebody's authority? I mean, it clearly is not the only meaning of pistis. But I don't think I'm not saying that belief on authority might not sometimes be called pistis, but I don't think that's what the New Testament means by faith. So the theologian's task, in my view, is to help people think as clearly, as well as they can about their heritage and about what's good in it and what's bad in it and how it can inform their lives and whether they really want to be informed in that way. And I don't think it's to develop a creed. I mean, I think it's fine to formulate creeds out of what you believe at any given time. But the creed you formulate today, if that's still your creed 10 years from now, that means you are pretty stuck. And being stuck is not a Christian virtue.
No, it's not. Okay, so the last question is about something that's different between you and I and maybe some of the other people that will be in the class. You were a missionary's kid from the South. I was a Baptist preacher's kid from the South. I regularly would joke when explaining to people in Scotland that religious diversity where I grew up was the kind of Baptist you were. I didn't know a Methodist till middle school when I moved to a city, John. And so when you said part of the reason you stay Christian is I've been so formed by was the line. There are a lot of people who are in some sense religious free agents, people who didn't grow up inheriting any wisdom tradition. And for those that have an interest in Christianity, especially one, shaped by the influence of process philosophy and such, where's the place you advise people begin, or what are the point, the kind of touchstones of Christianity where if you haven't been informed by, where it isn't part of your inheritance, that you find most life-giving and inviting?
Well, I think reading a gospel would be a good idea as a place to begin. And people should know when they read a gospel that it can't be literally true in every respect because it contradicts what the other gospels say. But the contradictions are not, most of them, some of them are really very, I mean, whether the women who, after they left the tomb, kept it to themselves and never told anybody, which is a rather strange idea, but it's what Mark tells us, or whether they told the other disciples. I think that these are rather different pictures of what went on and the importance of the empty tomb and so forth. Some of the ways in which you get just flat contradictions. But basically, we ought to know that almost any event is described differently by different people who participated in it. And the Bible is written by ordinary human beings, and each one told it the way that made most sense to them. But after you've heard several people tell the story, even though you can't believe all of them and have it exactly right, you nevertheless have a reasonably good idea of what they're all testifying to. So if people read that way, and I think the people you're talking about, have a better chance of reading that way than people who grew up with the dogma that the Bible is inerrant or so forth. So I think people who are secular may have a better chance of reading about this strange person and being moved by that story. And I think that's a good place to begin.
I think it's interesting that your response is the compelling nature of the story of Jesus. Because so often the conversations around Christianity in the public square are, a pronouncement about some ethical issue, yay or nay on, or, the failures or the success of some particular Christian or Christian group, and that kind of thing. But to point back to the story and narrative of Jesus as a place to begin is, I don't know, John, it sounds
unusual. It may be unusual, but it's kind of natural, isn't it? I mean,
yeah, I know, but I don't know, but I've heard you're really
about Jesus. That would mean what he said would be important.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like if more Christians just read the Gospels, it might help as well.
That would help. That would help.
Yes. Well, I've really enjoyed our conversation today. I'm looking forward to spending 6 weeks together, and I hope anyone that's interested, head over to ChristianityInProcess.com and join the fun. Well, I am definitely looking forward to it and really appreciate getting to do this with you. And all of you listening, I hope you head over to ChristianityInProcess.com and join the fun.